today, and our co-panelists will be Congressman Carson, who hopefully, I hope you'll be joining shortly, and Salam Al-Marayati. In the meantime, I'll just go ahead and introduce both of them so we can get moving.
Brilliant.
Forward.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Happy Mother's Day to all of the mothers and caregivers out there, and Ramadan Mubarak. My name is Samar Kaukab, and I'm excited to lead today's conversation with two very special guests. And before beginning, I'd like to thank the Concordia Forum for this opportunity and everyone who's listening in. Our guests today, as I've mentioned, are Congressman Carson and Salam Al-Marayati. Congressman Carson was elected to serve Indiana's 7th Congressional District in 2008 and has focused on growing the economy, strengthening national security, and building a stronger middle class. As chairman of the Counterterrorism, Counterintelligence, and Counterproliferation Subcommittee, that's a handful, on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, he plays a vital role in ensuring the United States has the resources needed to identify, track, and defeat dangerous threats. During the 116th Congress, Carson serves as a senior whip for the House Democratic Caucus, sits on the powerful House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, and is a member of the Congressional Black Caucus. He is also a proud member of the Progressive Caucus and the LGBT Equality Caucus, and the longest serving Muslim in the United States Congress. Before taking office, the congressman served on the Indianapolis City County Council and worked full-time in law enforcement. And the bio now for our other guest, Salam Al-Marayati, nationally recognized for his commitment to improving the public understanding of Islam and policies impacting American Muslims. Salam is president and co-founder of the Muslim Public Affairs Council. He oversees MPAC's groundbreaking civic engagement, public policy, and advocacy work. He's an expert on Islam in the West, Muslim reform movements, human rights, democracy, national security, and Middle East politics. He has spoken at the White House, Capitol Hill, and represented the US in international human rights and religious freedom conferences. He serves as a faith-based advisor to the Department of Homeland Security, the 2019 report of which was a report on countering white supremacist violence targeting houses of worship. And now for the audience, please feel free to enter your questions in the chat box, and I'll save some time at the end for participant questions as well. So now, before we begin, I have to ask both of you a favor, and I first want to confirm if Congressman Carson is on.
I think he is. I think okay. Adnan, I think it's under Adnan's name, but I think that is the congressman.
Okay, great. Welcome. So now before we begin, I have to ask you both a favor. There's a lot of ground we have to cover, so I hope we can spend no more than a few minutes on each question so that we also have time to get to the participant questions in the end. So I'll get right to it. Congressman Carson, 3 people were killed by Indianapolis police officers over the last few days. Coupled with the February shooting of a young Black man out for a run in Georgia, the conversation around race and police violence seems to be reaching a boiling point. As an African American, as a former police officer, and as a member of the US Congress, what does this moment mean to you?
That's a great question. I think it means so much in many ways because I think we're at a crossroads between how do we leverage the blessing of social media now that the world has become smaller, at least digitally, to increase our activism in the midst of quarantining, but also bringing to light the historical inequities as it relates to policing the Black community versus other communities. Just a glimpse at New York City. We saw pictures on one end of white brothers and sisters in the Village and other parts of New York being handed surgical masks or masks for COVID. But right across in Brooklyn, we saw African Americans being detained and even beaten by law enforcement. I'm a former police officer. As a young Muslim at the age of 17, I just turned 17, I was arrested outside of a mosque. I, along with another young man, and we were charged with battery on a police officer, resisting arrest, and fleeing. I was used to interacting with law enforcement, being detained, being called the N-word, but that was the first time I was actually arrested, trying to stay out of trouble and not get in trouble. I wasn't a bad kid. I was at a mosque, in fact, and I was arrested. And so being a part of law enforcement, so I've been in handcuffs and I've placed handcuffs on people. And I know the historical implications and the roots of American policing dating back to slave catchers during slavery. So we know that there's institutionalized racism in law enforcement departments. We have to go across the country and look at their lethal force policies. When I was in the police academy, there was a concept called the 1+1 theory. So you start with a verbal command. If a verbal command proves itself to be inadequate, you go to a taser or a baton. And beyond that, you go to a firearm. What is happening right now, law enforcement agencies are saying because of exigent or emergency circumstances, one doesn't have time to wrestle with those stages, so there's a force continuum. The most dangerous calls that police officers get are domestic calls and traffic stops. What we saw the other day, and I had a conversation with the FOP, and they're still mad at me about my tweet. They accused me of stirring up racial tension. They accused me of being a part of a movement in Indianapolis that is seeking to ambush police officers, and nothing could be further from the truth. What I won't do is allow people who have not experienced my pain or the pain of my community to tell me how I should be outraged. And so the Muslim community, we are at a crossroads because we face similar issues as it relates to policing, but maybe not policing in the traditional context. In some ways, yes, but in policing amongst federal law enforcement, policing with intel agencies, warrantless surveillance. So we have to deal with these civil liberty issues in a way where we can't back up anymore. We have to be bold. We have to speak out against these issues. Thank God for the MPACs and the CARES of the world and the Concordia Forum. If we allow ourselves to be silent in the midst of police brutality and racism, we failed not only as good citizens, but as representatives and public servants, head of NGOs and politicians. If we allow police academies to still reinforce white supremacist ideology. When I was a young recruit at the Indiana Law Enforcement Academy in 1999, there was a young recruit who had a t-shirt on of Mussolini, Stalin, Hitler, and someone else. I can't remember at the time. The black and brown recruits, I was a squad leader, we reported him. We all sat in a room and he said, well, I don't agree with everything Hitler has done, but he has done some good things. He was clearly a white supremacist. The last bastion of white supremacy to operate is in the midst of law enforcement agencies. And so we have to be critical of training policies. We need more Muslim police officers. We need more African-American police officers who have a certain mentality, not one of wanting to be accepted, but one of offering the kind of objectivity that's necessary to challenge the constructs of police departments that I think are still extensions of white supremacist ideology.
Congressman Carson, another question for you. Political leaders lead by example, some of them in the wrong direction. You've been a political leader for many years now, but this time we're in now is different. With a cratering economy, a pandemic, racial tensions and disparities, as you've discussed, and a decisive 2020 election around the corner, what specific values do you draw upon to lead in this moment? And are they different from what you relied on in the past?
I think we're all changing. I think those of us who try to be introspective, I'm always concerned about the race question. I'm always concerned about the economy and joblessness. I think that's an issue that we all can agree upon. One of the additional packages, CARES 2.0, CARES 5, CARES 6, whatever you want to call it, will be focused not only on giving resources to community hospitals and senior care facilities, but we want to talk about infrastructure because infrastructure is a job creator. We have the highest unemployment numbers since the Great Depression. Something has to be done very clearly to help small businesses who are suffering tremendously. We now have Black and brown businesses who are not only underbanked, they're non-banked. Many of these people are sole proprietorships. They're filling out W-9s. Some of the smaller businesses may have one or two employees, and those folks are seasonal. So we have to deal with the economic question. Secondly, I'm deeply concerned about education, what education looks like in this digital age, what it looks like in the midst of quarantine. Those of us who are parents understand the struggle of having now to rally children and help with content that we didn't have to deal with at their age. And I think most importantly, I'm concerned about those voices who are not heard, be they women voices, be they minority voices, be they voices from religious minorities that are discriminated against. I mean, it's one thing for us to repost and post things that sound good and make us feel good, but what do our actions yield? What are our actions saying? Are we really being committed to what we post and what we say? And of course, in the midst of all of that, I think there is a sense of kind of unlearning what we were taught growing up, and things that were once acceptable are no longer acceptable. And we're seeing that shift even in the Muslim community. I can remember going to the masjid. My uncle at the time was the imam, Umar al-Khattab, and he would let me register voters. And I can even remember Muslims saying, oh, astaghfirullah, Brother Salim, this is haram. No, you can't register voters here. This was pre-9/11. After 9/11, we realized we didn't have much representation in elective office. We didn't have representation in zoning boards. That would have helped when ISNA tried to build their headquarters right down the road from me. And so we had to wrestle with this political question of where we are in our society. In the midst of the COVID conversation, all of the Muslim physicians in our community should be at the forefront. I would love to see more Muslim representation in the forefront. I just heard a stat the other day, and Dr. Salam can help me out, that 15% of the physicians in Michigan State happen to be Muslim. Very encouraging for someone like me to hear. I would love to see greater representation in law enforcement, greater representation. We know we have educators, we know we have scholars who are all brilliant. I'd love to see more representation in our banking community. We have so much representation in the fintech space. I don't want to put you on the spot, but your brother was one of the first to show me a health app years ago. Before Apple even came out with their apps and health kits, your brother was one of the pioneers of tracking wellness and health. I'd love to see him on a TED Talk with Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg.
Inshallah, he's on this call, so shout out to him.
Oh, my man, yeah.
Turning to Salam. So the diversity in the American Muslim political spectrum seems to be increasing. More and more, we have a solid progressive base coming forward with young Muslims aligning with others their age. At the same time, there's an increasing divide between progressive and moderate Democrats, differences that map out over our communities too. Do you think this realignment is healthy for our communities? I think you're on mute, sorry.
Right. First of all, thank you to Concordia for inviting us, and really privileged to see Congressman Andre Carson, who is the most influential American Muslim today. He's been in the Congress for 12 years. He is on very important committees in the Congress, and we're really proud to be next to him, and we need to be supporting him in every way. And he actually was instrumental in helping form our congressional leadership program by bringing young Muslims onto Capitol Hill so that they could become staff members, and they are part of the brains of Capitol Hill right now. So I don't think that we acknowledge the work of Congressman Andre Carson enough. So I just want to take a moment to do that. So thank you for joining us, Congressman. As far as the divide, I think when we have crises like COVID-19 or wars of other sorts, it obliterates any divide. There really is no division. I think Muslims are actually more shoulder to shoulder on all these issues than we realize. We allow the rhetorical differences to really dominate the discourse. Whereas in reality, when we go to our mosques, when we go to our communities, when we go to our clinics, when we go to, as the congressman said, that 15% of physicians in Michigan are Muslim. And we have 96,000 small businesses in New York City that employ 250,000 people. How do we help them? How do we help the frontline workers? I turn on CNN now and I see doctors Seema Yasmin and Jahan El-Bayoumi talking about the epidemic. We have always been at the forefront of leadership on every crisis that is impacting America. And that is where we need to shift the lens. Not on the Sunni Shia divide or the liberal conservative divide or the old and the young divide. Yes, we're always going to have those differences of opinion, but let's not allow the satanic whispers, especially in Ramadan, when Satan is supposed to be locked up. Let's not allow those satanic whispers to diminish and marginalize the great work of American Muslims today. I think that's where our focus should be. There are Muslim women, as I said, 2 Muslim women physicians are leading our country in discussing how we are moving through this pandemic and the crisis. That's where our acknowledgement should be and our attention should be. How do we support those individuals and those leaders?
Salam, a lot of young Muslims turned out to vote for Bernie. And I know you're saying that we need to move past this and it's Ramadan, and I hear that point. But given that he's not the nominee and given their support for him, are you afraid that young Muslims won't turn out to vote? So essentially, how do we galvanize the Muslim vote?
Let me turn to an Islamic lesson about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. When he was thought to have been killed in one of the battles, the Battle of Uhud, there were Muslims who were demoralized and said, "Oh, where are we going to go? Where, it's over." Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran that if you think it's all about this one person, it's about Muhammad, yeah, you're done. But this is a larger cause. So even when it comes to the Prophet, we have to understand that he was chosen by God to deliver a message for us. And of course, we put him in the highest regard as the best of human beings and the mercy to humanity. But even the Quran tells us, don't put him outside what he was about. He was a human being on a mission. So if the Prophet is put into that understanding, I think we have to do the same in terms of Bernie Sanders. He was involved in a mission, critical, important for our country. But for those who quit now, this is the worst time to quit. If we are about a movement, then we go to the Democratic National Committee and work on the platform committee to make sure that the platform represents not just the sentiments of American Muslims, but the sentiment of the vulnerable communities, of all the disparities that are happening in our society. It is about equity. I don't want to be a part of any political party. I don't want to be a part of any organization. I don't want to be a part of any religion that does not have equity as its central point in our mission. That's what it is about. And this is the time to be more involved, to redouble our efforts, to make our voices heard. And I believe that with that commitment in time, inshallah, that mission will be realized for our country and for our community.
So diving deeper into this topic of our political priorities, Congressman Carson, looking back to America before the coronavirus crisis, what were Muslim communities not paying attention to? In terms of our priorities, where did our communities come up short?
You're on mute, Congressman.
I think you're still on mute, Congressman. There we go.
Okay, you're on now.
I don't want to speak in absolutes, but for the sake of the conversation, I think in many ways we kind of got caught up in this individualistic mindset, me, and of course, in today's society, if you're on Instagram or Facebook or TikTok or Snapchat or Twitter, you kind of have your own platform, your own TV show, your own whatever you want it to be. And we can oftentimes become or get addicted to likes or views or who's watching us. And I think in the midst of that individualism, I think we've kind of lost touch with the tenets of our faith. And charity is so important, and fasting is so important, not only because of the connection that we built with Allah, but because it makes us more deeply, or should make us more deeply sensitive to the needs of the less fortunate. During this time, we are isolated, but we still have the benefits of running water, electricity, and many of the amenities that we take for granted, cable TV, and even Wi-Fi being included. And so I think now it is time for us to focus on Palestinian brothers and sisters. It is time for us to focus on our inner cities in the United States of America. It's time for us to focus on food deserts in inner cities and in rural parts of our country. It's time to force us to look at the plight of the Kashmiris and what they're dealing with now. And so I think now that the world has become smaller digitally, it's an opportunity for us to put our hearts, minds, and money where our mouths and our posts are. And that is reaching out, being more sensitive to the needs of the less fortunate. And you know what? The things that we take for granted. This is Mother's Day. I miss my mom and my grandmom on this day. But you know what? I still reach out to those surrogate mothers and surrogate parents and my aunts and those other women in my life, and the people who who are struggling themselves, but who we can rely on to act as babysitters when we need them. Those folks that we can call when we don't want to talk to a therapist, those people that we can vent to all the time, who may be going through their own struggles. It's time for us probably to get out of our own heads and minds and think about those who lift us up each and every day.
Salam, since September 11th, American Muslim communities have had a core set of priorities. We care about Islamophobia, surveillance, the Muslim ban. But I wonder, does the coronavirus crisis change these? And if so, how?
Well, I think, first of all, much has changed from the coronavirus. Life before is very different from life after the onset of this coronavirus. So everything is different. And case in point, exactly to what the Congressman said, the whole situation even globally has changed. We can't look at, friend and foe the same way we looked at them before the coronavirus. If there's a country where the pandemic is in a hotbed that's going to infect the rest of us, we better send resources to those countries so that they can fight the pandemic for our own sake, for our own American interests. Number two, security now should be seen from a different lens. National security is about military security, is about policing, surveillance. And we spend as a country about $1 trillion a year on that. If you consider the Department of Defense and the Department of Justice and the CIA and the FBI and the National Security Council and the Counterterrorism Center and the Office of Director of National Intelligence and so many other offices within other agencies that deal with Homeland Security and the Department of Homeland Security, that's about $1 trillion a year. We need to change that from national security, which is the security of the state, and put the focus on human security. Human security is the protection of civilian populations. When we talk about protective gear for people on the front lines, that's human security. When we talk about essential workers and protecting them, that's human security. When we talk about vulnerable communities, especially minorities, who comprise the bulk of our essential worker force, that's human security. When we talk about health security and employment security, that is what we need to focus our attention on. And so that is where all of our energy at MPAC is right now in launching Human Security Now campaign, and to support the legislation that is supporting human security in terms of the various phases of the legislation. And then finally, on that issue, that will do away with this notion of Islamophobia. I could talk back and forth about Islamophobia. I can debate Islamophobia. Debating is not going to win hearts and minds, in my opinion. I mean, it's important. God bless those who are documenting the level of bigotry and racism and anti-Muslim discrimination in our country. That's important to know. But to move the needle, you have to change hearts and minds. Let me give you a short story then of somebody who's moving hearts and minds. There was a woman named Diane who was working in a Muslim country, and she's a Fulbright scholar. She had a dog, and you know how in our culture, dogs are viewed as impure and it's not seen, at least from that's the understanding, although I have a dog myself. But anyway, the community there in Turkey, when her dog died, they brought sweets to her house, as if this is what you do when a member of a family dies who's a neighbor. And she was touched by that compassion. So when she came back to the United States and saw what was happening to Muslims, she was appalled. And so she wanted to return that favor of compassion to Muslims. She had terminal cancer. She passed away. In her will, she left $441,000 to Muslim organizations to change hearts and minds of Christians in particular in our country, in Midwest states. And so that money will be used to deliver compassion on behalf of Diane. Just as there was compassion for her by Muslims, that is now returning to our favor. So these small acts, never underestimate the smallest of acts of compassion. God says in the Quran, the smallest of deeds, even if that is of a mustard seed, God will bring it to light. So that is the way we should approach post 9/11 stereotyping and Islamophobia and discrimination and racism and bigotry for all Americans. Muslims are only, a percentage of the racism and bigotry that's going on in this country. So let us work with the rest on racism and bigotry, but let us work to engage with the other, to deliver compassion and change hearts and minds that way.
As a follow-up question to that, Salam, given that we are, as a community, often on the receiving end of a lot of discrimination, that most of our communities are people of color, and that we're a small demographic, is it important for all of us to align politically as American Muslims, or should we run the political gamut?
We should align politically with the bulk of, or with the majority of we should align with those who serve America and American interests. And you're always going to have, you're never going to have 100%. And I don't think it's wise for us to put all our eggs in the basket of one political party or the other. So even if we are 90%, let's say with the Democrats, there's always going to be that 5 to 10%, either independent or with the Republican Party, the Sohail Khans of our community, that we need to make sure that they have a channel into that party. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, remember, he was always in communications with the Quraysh, even though they were fighting him and battling him, but trying to work things out. And there were people that he had who were still part of that structure, if you will, even though they were Muslims themselves, but they had lines of communication with the other side. The same here. We should always be open to communication with anybody. We demand a seat at the table, and it doesn't matter who's at that table. Friend or foe, we need to have a Muslim voice heard on healthcare and education and criminal justice and foreign policy. We demand a seat at the table there, and it doesn't matter what political affiliation. But yes, we have values, and we're going to be advocating for that values wherever we are.
Congressman Carson, 2018 saw the election of a number of new Democrats, some centrist and some progressive. These include the first 2 Muslim women in Congress. What do you make of the treatment of these women in mainstream conversations?
Unacceptable. I thought that Keith Ellison and I had a lot to deal with in terms of being called sleeper cells and terrorists, still being called terrorists. But what these sisters have had to endure is unacceptable. It's repugnant. And I think that for me, they have been so inspirational. They say I motivate them, and I'm a big brother to them, but they're motivational to me because the kind of resilience that I've seen in these women, not much different from the women who raised me, the kind of steeliness, being unapologetically Muslim, being bold in the midst of that kind of pressure, the kind of pressure that would have made other candidates and other politicians fold very rapidly. I think they're an inspiration not only to sitting members of Congress, but I think that they serve as an inspiration to future generations. As I traveled the country, Muslims, my friends used to tease me, about my speech. One day, we'll have a Muslim women in Congress and a Muslim president who may be a woman. And now, alhamdulillah, here we are. Inshallah. Inshallah, many more to come. Stay tuned.
Mm-hmm.
So Congressman Carson, what makes you different from Representatives Tlaib and Omar? Do you take a different approach? And if so, why?
I say this all the time. I mean, I think we're all complementary. I used to say this all the time about my big brother, Keith Ellison. Everywhere I'd go, they say, oh, Brother Keith is doing this. Why aren't you like this? Oh, Brother Keith is this. I'm saying, anyone who has had siblings understands. I mean, Keith is remarkably Keith. Keith is Michael Jackson. I think I'm probably more Prince, if you can use that analogy. But it's okay. I'm who I am. Not all Muslims are the same. Keith and I are in alignment, I think, on most things, but other things we have some philosophical and political differences. We're both Midwesterners. Keith comes from a very liberal district. Keith could probably set himself on fire naked in his district and get reelected. Those of us who are from Indiana and Ohio have a different set of political sensibilities in politics. And it's not just about political strategy, it's partly that, but it's also just about your constitution and who you are. I think we're just fundamentally two different people with different interests. And Keith's a bit older than I am. I mean, I'm middle-aged, but he's a bit older than me, so he has seen a bit more, but we're just fundamentally two different people. As brilliant as your brother is, you and your brother are not the same. And I'm sure you've probably had to remind folks very close to both of you, you're not the same. You're both geniuses. It's clear your parents have done a great job. I think I saw your dad pop up. But you two are totally different. It's probably annoying to get, you know, oh, yes, we know. But you're great, too. Look at you rocking and rolling. So, yeah, all different.
Yes, I am usually referred to as his sister. Every once in a while, he gets referred to as my brother, and it's a great moment when that happens. That's right. Salam, so we've spoken about diversity in the American Muslim spectrum. Given the stakes in the 2020 election and the shifting priorities you've spoken of, why is it important for American Muslims, particularly in this moment, to support Congressman Carson?
Well, I mean, I don't have to say anything. Just listen to what he said, and you know why we need to support Congressman Carson. I mean, the man is brilliant. He's experienced. He has the concern of the American Muslim community first and foremost in his agenda. He is our access point to the highest and most powerful people in the leadership of the Democratic Party and of the Congress right now. It would be a fool who would say, you know, don't pay attention or don't support this congressman. We have to support him, and inshallah, when this crisis is over, we're going to have the congressman come to Los Angeles, and we're going to be hosting him. And I want him to speak especially to the young people here, because they draw inspiration, just like they draw inspiration from Rashida and Ilhan. They draw inspiration from this congressman because he is someone who speaks to the hearts and minds of our young people. And I think he bridges that gap in our community between the liberal and the conservative, between the young and the old, between so many different people. I mean, he spoke about, you know, there's no two human beings that are the same. Absolutely. Like my wife and I are not the same, but we love each other. She's more brilliant than I am, of course. She's a lot smarter than I am. But we run a family together. The same thing for our community. Men and women are told what? You are protectors for one another. You are partners with each other. To do what? To enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong. To promote what is of social benefit and to prevent what is of public harm. That's the agenda. Don't get into who's right and who's wrong. I consider that a form of political takfir. You know how we complain about extremists that call one another, others kafirs, unbelievers, if they don't agree with them 100%. That has crept into our political culture now, that as soon as somebody has a different point of view or has a different idea and is not falling in line with our political movement or strategy, all of a sudden then he's or she is an outcast from the community. No, we should embrace these different ideas. Maybe they have an out-of-the-box idea that we need to think about. As long as they are committed to our community, they are part of our community. As long as you say, La ilaha illallah, Muhammadan Rasulullah, you are a Muslim. And that is what the Prophet told us. Don't get into this, who's a Muslim, who's not a Muslim, who's, you know, of course, there are those who are doing damage to the Muslim community that we see in their actions when they speak against Muslims, when they target Muslims, and when they spread this Islamophobia. But those who have political differences within this construct, within this community, and they're not 100% aligned with the rest of us, they are still part of the Muslim community.
Congressman Carson, we have a lot of Muslims now more than ever, as we've discussed, running for office, especially on the local level. As someone who pays close attention to local and state politics, how do you think having Representatives Tlaib and Omar in the House affects Muslims running for office?
I think it's a great inspiration. I think, as Dr. Salam mentioned, you know, the benefit of having 3 Muslims currently serving in Congress is that you see that we're not the same. And I would argue that there are Muslims who probably are far more conservative than even us, who are centrists and who have an opportunity, who have the resources, who have the education, who have the credibility, who have the political networks, who have the ability to raise money, not just from our community, which shows formidability, but from the outside community, who a part of our project has been to really press the DNC and the DCCC as it relates to the recruitment of candidates. You know, it's not enough for candidates to come to our community and get our money, say Ramadan Mubarak or Assalamu Alaikum, but when they leave our community, we kind of let them go, and they're not bold once they get into office. In fact, oftentimes they vote against our interest. And so we have to start presenting our own candidates, even some who will lose. But the fact that we're presenting candidates, formidable candidates, I think it changes the trajectory of our community. And I think having Ilhan and Rashida there is more than inspirational. I'm excited about Sister Nabila in Georgia. I'm excited about other Muslims who are running across the country. And I think that this is only the beginning.
So I'd like to shift gears a bit and take a few minutes here and have a conversation about Tara Reade's allegations against Vice President Biden. Congressman Carson, I identify as a Democrat, but I have to admit that the allegations against Joe Biden leave me deeply uncomfortable and unsure of what to do come November. Particularly in light of the Me Too movement, what is the ethical response to the allegations against Joe Biden?
Well, I think it's something that we have to be mindful of. We have to press as a dad, as a son, as a brother. I was raised by women who shared these stories with me. I know friends who have been raped, who have been harassed. And I think that whenever there's an allegation, I think it has to be investigated thoroughly. Whenever someone reports an assault, they have to be taken very seriously. Now, we know that there are sociopaths out there. We know that there are people who suffer from narcissistic personality disorder. And we know, I was raised in a house where women who were feminists, but who also taught me as a Black man to be careful, because we had a picture of Emmett Till in the house too. And he was a young man who was killed because he was falsely accused of whistling at a white woman. And it wasn't until decades later she admitted that she lied. So we do know, in an ideal world, I want to believe all women. And I think that that is we should believe most women, because most of the women I know have dealt with some form of sexual harassment and discrimination. And so I think that we have to investigate these matters. We can't minimize these matters, because too many women have been hurt and they've been sexually assaulted. And some men have been sexually assaulted, but because we've grown up in this society where women have been mistreated and viewed as second-class citizens, things that we think or view as masculine are forgiven and overlooked, while women continue to suffer, and oftentimes in silence. But I think that we should always have a thorough investigation. And I think that the appropriate channels, law enforcement and other channels, should be looked at very thoroughly. If it's a work situation, human resources should be looked at very thoroughly. But also, we have to make sure that there are protections in place for those who make the claims. And I think that there should be a response if people make false claims. You know, one thing as a politician, Summer, is people call you a lot of things. And, you know, to have a daughter say, well, Dad, I went online and they're saying you're a terrorist. I'm like, of course it's not true. Well, why would they say it? And, you know, I as a dad, I look at the rage that I would have if she were to divulge to me that she had been assaulted or abused or molested. The same goes for my siblings and even my mom and grandmother who have since passed away. And so I think as men, we have to take these things seriously, but we also know that there are people who have political agendas. Our staff dealt with the situation of a mentally ill person who physically assaulted a woman on our team. And he went online and made all kinds of hurtful claims against her. But we went to court, and of course the judge ruled in her favor, but it was a very stressful time for that young lady to deal with someone who could make obnoxious claims publicly. So he was trying to campaign in the court of public opinion, but when it came to the court of law, he failed. And I think oftentimes when you're not talking about people who have really been abused and who have been assaulted and who have been raped and have to suffer in silence, the small segment of people who have a political agenda, who make claims because they want to get popularity, they want to get a payout, or they have some kind of objective, I think they too should be met with grave punishments, because not only is there a law called reckless endangerment of the truth, as we saw with the Jesse Smollett situation, to make these kinds of claims to damage someone's reputation, they too have to be arrested and sent to jail or even prison.
Salam, clearly this is murky territory, and most civically engaged Muslims, of course, lean left. Some Democrats say we should vote for Joe Biden no matter the allegations against him, that he's the lesser of two evils. How does that make us any different than Republicans who hold their nose and vote for Trump?
I don't look at it that way, first of all. I think there's much more to it than just, the lesser of two evils construct. I think, number one, don't sit out on this election. There were tens of thousands of people that sat out this election in 2016 that really resulted in Trump becoming president. And it's a shame that by omission, you allow others to determine who your president is going to be. That's how I see it. So it is a responsibility for us to vote, because these are my tax dollars. And if I don't decide how my tax dollars are going to be used, someone else is going to decide that for me. And that is the beginning of disempowerment. And if we want empowerment, then we must demand that a vote is our Islamic obligation. So go and vote your conscience, but you have to vote. That's number one. Number two, when you think about the American Muslim community, we generate, let's say of the 6 million, 3 million generate a per capita income of 70,000. That's $200 billion a year that we pump into the economy. You know, there are 96,000 small business owners in New York City alone who are Muslim that employ 250,000 people. How do we translate that to political power? That's the issue. So our vote is going to count. And if 1% is going to make a difference in Michigan or Wisconsin or even Texas or Florida or Nevada, we best be involved in those states and put our resources there to make sure there is a Get Out the Vote campaign. And we're proud to be working with Engage for the Million Muslim Vote campaign as the leader in our community for that. That is an Islamic mission. If you look at it more broadly, those who care about what's happening in Palestine and Kashmir and the Uyghurs and the Rohingyas and the Indian Muslims, we are now, as American Muslims, more economically powerful than any Muslim majority country, especially with the oil prices going down. Their economies are going to suffer. We will surpass some of those countries in terms of economic power. So rather than going to them, these foreign countries, Muslim countries, for influence, they should be coming to us and seeking influence through us as American Muslims if we are organized in the right way. The White House should stop going to Saudi Arabia or anywhere in the Middle East for that matter and looking at those foreign countries as the reference point for Islam. They need to be looking to American Muslims as the reference point for Islam. We keep decrying, why is Islam looked as a foreign religion? Why is that happening? Well, it starts with the White House. And by the way, it happens with Democrats and Republicans in the White House. They look to those foreign countries as the reference point for Islam. It's time that they look at the economic power, the religious authority, the political representation to American Muslims, like Congressman Andre Carson, or the mayor of Artesia here in Los Angeles, or the state attorney general of Minnesota in Keith Ellison. These are the representatives of Islam for the U.S. government, and these are the people they need to be talking to. I'm sick and tired, and I'm glad in some ways that we're not having an iftar at the White House today. But I'm sick and tired of foreign diplomats representing us in the White House for the iftar. They can be involved. They're Muslim brothers and sisters, of course, but they should not take precedence over the American Muslim community when it comes to Ramadan.
So shifting to international affairs, Congressman Carson, from the Paris Climate Accords to threatening to cut funding from the WHO during a pandemic, can we rebuild America's standing in the world? Or is this, as some people say, the end of America as a global power? And as a follow-up question, why do you have hope in this moment?
I'm sorry?
Why do you have hope in this moment regarding America's standing in the world?
Well, I remain hopeful. I think, economies ebb and flow. I think nations ebb and flow. Some nations fall. But there's a lot of promise. I'm especially excited about what I'm seeing coming from young people. I'm excited about seeing the new kind of activism where we're seeing a rapid response to unethical behavior, illegal behavior. And I think Donald Trump, his presidency has been disastrous. It's been chaotic. But there are silver linings that could come out of this. And one of them is that I think we'll start taking political life more seriously. We no longer have the opportunity to blame our woes on mythical Illuminatis or these groups that are controlling us. We have a responsibility to participate in America's political life. So my hope comes from seeing Brother Nabil and his ingenuity in creating apps for the next generation. My hope comes from sisters like you who have yet to run for office, but are being very Socratic in your line of questioning and taking your job very seriously. I hope that we could turn this into a platform where I'm talking to you on CNN one day, or your own network, who knows? And so to see the Ilhans, the Rashidas, the Dr. Salams, the Arsalan Iftikhars, and so many smart folks in our community really take a place and speak out during these times. 20 years ago, I think a lot of Muslims would have been too well adjusted to speak out. 20 years ago, pre 9/11, too many Muslims would have been safe to kind of exist peacefully without saying anything. Don't call me Muhammad, call me Mo, let me be quiet. But now, can't afford to be silent, can't afford to be quiet. I see Sister Samar's posts and I'm like, wow, we follow the same people dealing with narcissistic personality disorder. I love it. And I think, I think this is a time in our community where we have to really talk about some of the things that are still taboo. Dr. Salam made a great point about the White House seeking cues from outside of our country. I think another thing that we have to look at is really still dealing with the racism that exists in our community, the sexism that exists in our community, possibly the NPD, the sociopathic behavior, maybe some psychopaths lurking in our community that we have to sift through, who are still charming and personable, but deeply manipulative. And when you disagree with them, they don't care who they slander or who they damage. It's their way or the highway. So we have to not be so ethereal and mystical and have to deal with real life issues. And it starts at home first.
Salam, pivoting now to the economic crisis, which you've discussed for a bit. This is the economic crisis that we find ourselves in now. So we know that African-American communities, immigrants, women, the new numbers we have on unemployment show gross racial and gender disparities. Muslims are heavily represented in these demographic categories. What is MPAC doing to organize and protect these communities?
Well, that's our Human Security Now campaign. Those demographics serve those demographics. Our campaign serves those demographics first and foremost. And it's for the best interests of America to deal with these inequities. And by the way, these inequities have been going on, existed for a long time, as we all know, but it flared up in this pandemic, and the holes in our healthcare system now are gaping. And unless we fix it, then we will become a failed state. We will look back and say, oh, how nice it was before 2020 that we had, jobs and healthcare and that sense of security. If we don't fix it now, this will affect everybody. Now, the Human Security Campaign is about defending the unalienable rights of every American. And case in point is the criminal justice system. There is a pandemic happening in many of our prisons in the country because of the inhumane treatment of people, because of how poor and minorities are incarcerated, based on the system that the Congressman was talking about. That many of our law enforcement agencies unfortunately still have that racist culture in it. So this is a time for criminal justice reform to not only bring equity, bring justice to criminal justice, but to prevent the pandemic from spreading. So this is what we're doing in looking at that. And if you can give me the luxury, Samar, of asking the Congressman a question, there's been some legislation on the issue of testing, tracing, isolation, and surveillance that you're a co-sponsor, HR 6666. And there are some people who are concerned that we're now going to let the federal government get our information, and this is a way of gathering more intelligence on communities. And so I want your expertise on framing that, and how do we speak about that to our community?
I think it's an important question. I mean, the Muslim community, like the African American community and Latino community, are rightly suspicious of the government. Particularly with the African American community, we've seen where public health officials have misled African Americans and performed experiments on African Americans, injecting them with syphilis. I'm referring to the Tuskegee experiment that happened decades ago. But I think contact tracing is by and large conducted by local public health officials. However, they are overwhelmed at the moment, and they need federal support. When you have a bill that's bill number is titled 6666, it doesn't help your efforts at all.
Right.
But it's a bill. Anyone can introduce a bill. And Bobby Rush, former Black Panther, a good friend, and he's been a great leader. He's someone that I trust. When a bill comes to your office, by the way, there are thousands of bills that we vote on, but when a bill from Bobby Rush comes to your office, it kind of sparks your brain a bit. And he's been a leader on public health issues, having publicly dealt with health issues himself. And so it's a proposal. It hasn't passed. It has yet to even go through committee yet. And so I wanted to be supportive simply because I know that our local public health officials are being stretched thinly. Now, as you know, Dr. Salam, like any piece of legislation, it's not perfect. If it even comes out of committee the way it was originally proposed will be a task indeed. But even when bills are signed into law that are imperfect, we can always go back throughout the years and make necessary corrections. But without contact tracing, quite frankly, we're basically fighting the pandemic in the dark. We don't know. Right. Federal law already has pretty strong protections against misuse of private information. We always do a better job, but I think the spirit of the bill is positive. It doesn't mean it's perfect. We can always make corrections as it develops and goes through committee.
Thank you for that answer. I think we need public education on that as much as we need,
good point,
to influence our policymakers. But there are a lot of conspiracy theories whirling around out there, and then that's going to prevent people from even getting tested. And so empowering community health clinics, which is what I saw as really the crux of that bill that Bobby Rush is leading us on, and that's what human security is about too, is to empower the community health centers in our local communities to be the focal point, so that they are the ones who actually have trust with people, and people will then go and get their testing. And the more we empower them, then the more successful we are in fighting this pandemic.
That's a great point.
Thanks for that great question, Salam. So, I'm always amazed by how quickly these things go, and I could go on for another hour with questions, but I won't, so I'll spare you both. But as a reminder to everyone listening in, Indiana has a primary to determine the Democratic candidate for the 7th District coming up on June 2nd, which is just a few short weeks away. Congressman Carson will be running in that contest, and we want him, of course, in the House, which means he needs our support.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but thank you everyone for listening, and over to you, Mudassar and Zahid.
Good job, Samar.
Thank you.
Great job, Samar. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you to Concordia and Zahid and Mudassir. Thank you for your great leadership as always. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I like the kufi, Mudassir. I like the kufi, brother. I was going to ask you for a bean pie for a minute, but I had to remember.
There's a hat theme going on every week, new hat.
I love it.
Great. Thank you, Samar. It's Farina, part of the Concordia team. Really well chaired. I really enjoyed that. That was really structured and you got through a lot. Salam, thank you very much. And Andre, we really look forward to having you at Concordia in person.
Hello. I mean, Farina, we've been doing this dance for years.